Hello students. So today's video is a discussion of the third slot of CAT 24, the VARC section. Well, as you know, 24 questions and the order was not predetermined. I mean, it wasn't a straightforward first RCs then verbal ability order. They were jumbled. So we will take them up in the order in which they appear. So we start with the first question, which is a question which asks you to identify the best fit for a particular sentence within a paragraph. So let's deal with that. So the sentence is, taken outside the village of Tran Bang, and a name like that sounds Vietnamese, on June 8th, 1972. The picture carried the trauma and indiscriminate violence of a conflict that claimed, by some estimates, 1 million or more civilian lives. Now, the sentence itself tells you that it's talking about a picture, and it says the picture, which means it has to come after you have talked about a picture. Okay. The horrifying photograph of children fleeing a deadly napalm attack. Napalm, we know, is a substance that burns and burns fiercely, and the Americans actually used it as part of bombs in the Vietnam War. Okay, so a horrifying photograph of children fleeing a deadly napalm attack has become a defining image not only of the Vietnam War but of the 20th century. Now, when you say that taken outside the village of Tran Bang, the picture let's say captured the trauma and indiscriminate violence of conflict, 1 million or more civilian lives. Now, when you actually have that sentence, would you place it in one? Because when you say dark smoke billowing behind them, the dark smoke billowing behind them is actually a reference to the children, not to the lives, isn't it? So, which means you wouldn't want to put it in one. So, dark smoke billowing behind them, the young subjects' faces are painted with a mixture of terror, pain and confusion. Okay. And then again you wouldn't put it in two, because the following statement says, soldiers from the South Vietnamese armies of 25th Division follow helplessly behind. Behind whom? Behind these children who are actually running. Okay. Now, following that it says, the picture was officially titled The Terror of War. Okay. But the photo is better known by the nickname given to the naked 9-year-old at its center, Napalm Girl. Now, if you were to place that sentence, it actually has to be either in 3 or in 4. But the statement before 4, the picture was officially titled, right? Now, you talk about the picture and then you talk about its title, not the title and then the picture. And secondly, when you say, the photo is better known by the nickname given to the naked 9-year-old at the center, Napalm Girl, then we are not going to talk about any further discussion. Would actually have to be about Napalm Girl or how she represented the horrors of the war and so on and so forth. So 4 is not the place where it would go. So the best place for it is 3. Now let's just read it in that sequence then. So if we were to, let's say, read it in that sequence, what we have, so soldiers from the South Vietnamese Army 25th Division follow helplessly behind. Then coming to the photograph, taken outside the village of Tran Bang on June 8, 1972, the picture captured the trauma and indiscriminate violence of conflict that claimed, by some estimates, 1 million or more civilian lives. The picture was officially titled The Terror of War, but the photo is better known by the nickname given to the girl, who they call Napalm Girl. So, which means 3 is the best place for the sentence, and the option therefore would be choice 2. So, option 2 is the answer to question 1. Here we are asked for summaries, and you have 4 summaries provided, one of which is the best one for the passage given. Humans have managed to tweak the underlying biology of various plants and animals to produce high-tech crops and microbes. But regulating these entities is complicated, as the framework of policies and procedures are outdated and not flexible enough to adapt to emerging technology. The question is whether regulation will ever be able to keep up with human innovation. To regulate living things, which are apt to be unpredictable and unique, to capture all the potential risks when the new biological entities are introduced or when they pass on variations of their genes. In other words, you've managed to bring about, let's say, biological modification, but it probably needs regulation, but it's going to be difficult to regulate, because when you're dealing with something as unpredictable as a living creature, and it's going to, let's say, evolve and change, how do you even come up with regulation? So the problem is that, and that has to be captured in the summary. So the mercurial nature of biological entities calls for scientists to shape the regulations. It doesn't say scientists need to shape the regulations. There is no discussion here saying scientists need to shape the regulations. So scientists shaping the regulations is not what this thing talks about. Okay, so that is out. Then the problem with formulating regulation for innovation in the scientific arena is that it is impossible to imagine the outcomes or risks related to the outcomes of all the research. The problem with formulating regulation for innovation in the scientific arena is that it is impossible to imagine the outcomes or risks related to the outcomes of all research. But are we talking about all science and all research, or are we talking about biotechnology? Biotechnology, which means 2 doesn't work either. A new framework of rules and procedures for regulating the most recent research emerging from BT is urgently needed, but this does not discuss what the difficulty is, isn't it? Current regulation of biotechnology is outdated, but it is debatable if we can create a framework, imaginative and flexible, to cover all the contingencies in this fast changing area, which means biotechnology probably needs regulation, but how can we come about with regulation in something that is changing so quickly, which means 4 is the one that sums up the discussion. So, 4 is the answer to question. We have picked the odd one out. So, you have a para jumble, one statement doesn't belong and you have to identify which statement that is. So, part of the appeal of forecasting is not just that it seems to work, but that you don't seem to need specialized expertise to succeed at it. So, let's just put 1 there because we don't know where it goes. Fine. And the tight connection between forecasting and building a model of the world helps explain why so much of the early interest in the idea came from the intelligence community. The tight connection between forecasting and building a model of the world. So, we are talking about 2 entities here, we are talking about 2 different things, whereas one focuses only on one thing. So, if we were to actually talk about that, we might actually say forecasting and building a model, we might actually have to have discussed forecasting, then discuss building a model, then come to let us say the tight connection. So, 2 would actually probably come much later if at all. Okay. 3. This was true even though the latter had access to classified intelligence. Now, who is the latter here? We don't know. Okay. So, let us just keep 3 separately for a moment. We don't know what the latter is. One frequently cited study found that the accurate forecasters' predictions of geopolitical events, when aggregated using standard scientific methods, were more accurate than the forecasts of members of the US intelligence community who answered the same questions in a confidential prediction market. So, could, let us say, the latter in 3 be actually the 2 agencies being mentioned in 4? Possible. So, let us just consider that 4 and 3 possibly are connected. Now, the aggregated opinions of non-experts doing forecasting have proven to be a better guide to the future than the aggregated opinions of experts. Now, we say when you are talking about one frequently cited study found that accurate forecasters' predictions of geopolitical events, when aggregated using standard scientific methods, were more accurate than the forecasts of members of the US intelligence community. Now, when you say the aggregated opinions of non-experts doing forecasting, right? Now, the non-experts would be, let us say, forecasters' predictions of geopolitical events using scientific methods. They are not experts, they are not intelligence. But the aggregated opinion of experts, the US intelligence community, which means 5 is actually related to 4 and 3. So, we know 5, 4 and 3 are actually connected. Now, if 5, 4 and 3 are connected, then does 1 come in connection with 5, 4, 3 or does 2? Now, the point is, part of the appeal of forecasting is not just that it seems to work, but you don't seem to need specialized expertise to succeed at it. Okay, because forecasting done by non-experts is very often better than forecasting done by experts. Then 4 is an example of that. It gives you data to back up that statement. And 3, this was true even though the latter had access to classified intelligence. That means this was true even though the latter were experts. So, 2, the tight connection between forecasting and building a model of the world, that is a different discussion. That is a different discussion. So, our sequence is actually 1, 5, 4, 3 and the odd statement is 2. What this thing talks about is forecasting, even when done by non-experts, is very often better than when done by experts. So, the connection between forecasting and building a model of the world is not actually related to this paragraph. So, the answer to this question is 2. Again, we are looking at putting the sentence into the best place in the paragraph. Many have had to leave their homes behind, with more than 1.3 million people being displaced due to the drought. Where is this? Okay. Somalia has been dealing with an enormous humanitarian catastrophe, okay, driven by the longest and most severe drought in the country. The country has experienced in at least 40 years. Now, when you say many have had to leave their homes behind, that would be the effect. But if you're talking about the drought, then explaining the drought would come before the effect. So 5 consecutive rainy seasons have failed, causing more than 8 million people, almost half the country's population, to experience acute food insecurity. And then, because of this lack of food, more than 43,000 people are believed to have lost their lives, with half of the lives lost likely being children under 5. Now, the damage, now we come to the effect. The damage the drought has caused is far-reaching. Okay. Now, when you say many have had to leave their homes behind, then it's probably not going to be in 1 and 2, because we still have to explain why the enormous the drought has actually happened, because it's saying driven by the longest and most severe drought, and then you have to talk about the drought. Then the 43,000 people have lost their lives, actually thanks to the fact that there's no food. Now, the damage the drought has caused is far-reaching. Now, we'll talk about the effects of the drought itself. Farmers have lost all their agricultural income, while pastoralists have lost more than 3 million livestock, impoverishing entire communities and leaving them on the brink of famine. Now, if people have lost everything that they have, that is when they actually move. That is when they actually go elsewhere. That is when they actually seek to migrate. And so, instead of in 3, 4 is actually the best option, because farmers have lost all their agricultural income, while pastoralists have lost more than 3 million livestock, impoverishing entire communities, leaving them on the brink of famine, many of whom of the farmers and the pastoralists have had to leave their homes behind, with more than 1.3 million people being displaced due to the drought. Then some, like the pastoralists, may never be able to go back. They've been displaced and they never would be able to go back, as their livelihoods have been irreversibly wiped out, which means 4 is actually the best place for this question. So, option 4 is your answer to 4. We now come down to a summary question again. Lyric poetry is a genre of private meditation rather than public commitment. The impulse in Marxism towards changing a society deemed unacceptable in this basic design would seem to place demands on lyric poetry that such poetry, with its tendency toward the personal, the small scale and the idiosyncratic, could never answer. There is within Marxism, however, also a strand of thought that would locate in lyric poetry alternative models of perception and description that call forth a vision of world at odds with the repressive reality, or that draw attention to the workings of ideology within the hegemonic culture. The poetic imagination may indeed deflect larger social concerns, but it may also be implicitly critical and utopian, which means the thought was that lyrical poetry would not necessarily find a place in Marxism, but even with Marxist thought, there is a space that lyric poetry actually serves in either presenting social concerns, speaking out against repression, or even providing critical and utopian thought. So, that being the case, the focus of lyrical poetry as personal may not seem compatible with Marxism. However, it is possible to envisage lyrical poetry as a symbol of resistance against an oppressive culture. It's possible. Let's just hold that there. What about 2? The focus of lyric poetry is largely personal, while that of Marxism is bringing change in society. Unless that difference is resolved, poetry will remain utopian? No. What the passage says is, there is a space in lyric poetry for Marxism. So, 2 doesn't work. 3. Marxism has internal contradictions, due to which one strand of Marxism sees no merit in lyrical poetry, while another appreciates. Are we saying that there is one side of Marxism that doesn't care for lyrical poetry and the other side does? That's a distortion. So, we don't need 3. 4. Marxism makes unreasonable demands on lyrical poetry. It doesn't say what Marxism requires of lyrical poetry. However, lyrical poetry has its own merits that are largely ignored by Marxism due to its personal nature. No, what this passage tells us is that while it might not seem as if poetry has a place in Marxism, in fact it does, because there are poets and there is poetry in which statements are made, or at least sentiments are expressed about repression and let's say the repressive societies, social concerns, but it could also be critical and utopian. So, 1 then is the answer to question 5. Do remember, of course, that careful reading is always the key You can't afford to come down to choices unless you have interpreted your paragraphs properly. So read, think about paragraphs, assess the ideas that they carry, work out flow, and then come down to answers. So that would be a much better way of, that would be a good way of doing it. And for preparation, of course, reading is your best preparation. Along with everything else that you do, please ensure that you read, expand your vocabulary, your ability with sentences and flow, and then you will find these things much easier to do. So thank you and all the best.